22. The Decline of Religion. Taken from The Cherwell, Oxford, Volume 26, 29th of November 1946, reproduced in Undeceptions, 1971, then in First and Second Things, 1985, and now in Compelling Reason, 1998. From what I see of Junior Oxford at present, it would be quite easy to draw opposite conclusions about the religious predicament of what we call the rising generation, though in reality the undergraduate body includes men and women almost as much divided from one another in age, outlook and experience as they are divided from the dons. Plenty of evidence can be produced to show that religion is in its last decline among them, or that a revival of interest in religion is one of their most noticeable characteristics. And in fact, something that may be called a decline and something that may be called a revival are both going on. It will be perhaps more useful to attempt to understand both than to try our luck at spotting the winner. The decline of religion, so often lamented or welcomed, is held to be shown by empty chapels. Now, it is quite true that chapels which were full in 1900 are empty in 1946. But this change was not gradual. It occurred at the precise moment when chapels ceased to be compulsory. It was not, in fact, a decline, it was a precipice. The 60 men who had come because chapel was a little later than rollers, its only alternative, came no more. The 5 Christians remained. The withdrawal of compulsion did not create a new religious situation, but only revealed the situation which had long existed. And this is typical of the decline in religion all over England. In every class and every part of the country, the visible practice of Christianity has grown very much less in the last 50 years. This is often taken to show that the nation as a whole has passed from a Christian to a secular outlook. But if we judge the 19th century from the books it wrote, the outlook of our grandfathers, with a very few exceptions, was quite as secular as our own. The novels of Meredith, Trollope, and Thackeray are not written either by or for men who see this world as the vestibule of eternity, who regard pride as the greatest of the sins, who desire to be poor in spirit and look for a supernatural salvation. Even more significant is the absence from Dickens' Christmas Carol of any interest in the Incarnation. Mary, the Magi, and the angels are replaced by spirits of his own invention, and the animals present are not the ox and ass in the stable, but the goose and turkey in the poulterer's shop. Most striking of all is the 33rd chapter of The Antiquary, where Lord Glenallan forgives old Elspeth for her intolerable wrong. Glenallan has been painted by Scott as a lifelong penitent and ascetic, a man whose every thought has been for years fixed on the supernatural. But when he has to forgive, no motive of a Christian kind is brought into play. The battle is won by the generosity of his nature. It does not occur to Scott that his fasts, his solitudes, his beads, and his confessor, however useful as romantic properties, could be effectively connected with a serious action which concerns the plot of the book. I am anxious here not to be misunderstood. I do not mean that Scott was not a brave, generous, honourable man and a glorious writer. I mean that in his work, as in that of most of his contemporaries, only secular and natural values are taken seriously. Plato and Virgil are, in that sense, nearer to Christianity than they. Thus the decline of religion becomes a very ambiguous phenomenon. One way of putting the truth would be that the religion which has declined was not Christianity. It was a vague theism with a strong and virile ethical code which, far from standing over against the world, was absorbed into the whole fabric of English institutions and sentiment, and therefore demanded church-going as, at best, a part of loyalty and good manners, or, at worst, a proof of respectability. Hence a social pressure, like the withdrawal of the compulsion, did not create a new situation. The new freedom first allowed accurate observations to be made. When no man goes to church except because he seeks Christ, the number of actual believers can at last be discovered. It should be added that this new freedom was partly caused by the very conditions which it revealed. If the various anti-clerical and anti-theistic forces at work in the 19th century had had to attack a solid phalanx of radical Christians, the story might have been different. But mere religion, morality tinged with emotion, what a man does with his solitude, the religion of all good men, has little power of resistance. It is not good at saying no. The decline of religion, thus understood, seems to me in some ways a blessing. At the very worst, it makes the issue clear. To the modern undergraduate, Christianity is at least one of the intellectual options. It is, so to speak, on the agenda. It can be discussed, and a conversion may follow. I can remember times when this was much more difficult. Religion, as distinct from Christianity, was too vague to be discussed, too sacred to be lightly mentioned, and so mixed up with sentiment and good form as to be one of the embarrassing subjects. If it had to be spoken of, it was spoken of in a hushed medical voice. Something of the shame of the cross is, and ought to be, irremovable. But the merely social and sentimental embarrassment is gone. The fog of religion has lifted. The positions and numbers of both armies can be observed, and real shooting is now possible. The decline of religion is no doubt a bad thing for the world. By it, all the things that made England a fairly happy country are, I suppose, endangered. The comparative purity of her public life, the comparative humanity of her police, and the possibility of some mutual respect and kindness between political opponents. But I am not clear that it makes conversions to Christianity rarer or more difficult. Rather the reverse. It makes the choice more unescapable. When the round table is broken, every man must follow either Galahad or Mordred. Middle things are gone. So much for the decline of religion. Now for a Christian revival. Those who claim that there is such a revival would point to the success in the sense that it can be tested by sales, of several explicitly and even violently Christian writers, the apparent popularity of lectures on theological subjects, and the brisk atmosphere of not unfriendly discussion on them in which we live. They point, in fact, to what I have heard described as the highbrow Christian racket. It is difficult to describe the phenomenon in quite neutral terms. But perhaps no one would deny that Christianity is now on the map among the younger intelligentsia, as it was not, say, in 1920. Only freshmen now talk as if the anti-Christian position were self-evident. The days of simple unfaith are as dead as those of simple faith. At this, those who are on the same side as myself are quite properly pleased. We have cause to give thanks. And the comments which I have to add proceed, I hope, not from a natural middle-aged desire to pour cold water into any soup within reach, but only from a desire to forestall, and therefore to disarm, possible disappointments. In the first place, it must be admitted by anyone who accepts Christianity that an increased interest in it, or even a growing measure of intellectual assent to it, is a very different thing from the conversion of England or even a single soul. Conversion requires an alteration of the will, and an alteration which, in the last resort, does not occur without the intervention of the supernatural. I do not in the least agree with those who therefore conclude that the spread of an intellectual and imaginative climate favourable to Christianity is useless. You do not prove munition workers useless by showing that they cannot themselves win battles, however proper this reminder would be if they attempted to claim the honour due to fighting men. If the intellectual climate is such that, when a man comes to the crisis at which he must either accept or reject Christ, his reason and imagination are not on the wrong side, then his conflict will be fought out under favourable conditions. Those who help to produce and spread such a climate are therefore doing useful work. And yet no such great matter after all. Their share is a modest one, and it is always possible that nothing whatever may come of it. Far higher than they stands that character whom, to the best of my knowledge, the present Christian movement has not yet produced. The preacher in the full sense, the evangelist, the man on fire, the man who infects. The propagandist, the apologist, only represents John Baptist. The preacher represents the Lord himself. He will be sent, or else he will not. But unless he comes, we mere Christian intellectuals will not effect very much. That does not mean we should down tools. In the second place, we must remember that a widespread and lively interest in a subject is precisely what we call a fashion, and it is the nature of fashions not to last. The present Christian movement may or may not have a long run ahead of it, but sooner or later it must lose the public ear. In a place like Oxford, such changes are extraordinarily rapid. Bradley and the other idealists fell in a few terms, the Douglas scheme even more suddenly, the Vorticists overnight. Who now remembers Pogo? Who now reads Childermas? Whatever in our present success mere fashion has given us, mere fashion will presently withdraw. The real conversions will remain, but nothing else will. In that sense, we may be on the brink of a real and permanent Christian revival, but it will work slowly and obscurely and in small groups. The present sunshine, if I may so call it, is certainly temporary. The grain must be got into the barns before the wet weather comes. This mutability is the fate of all movements, fashions, intellectual climates, and the like. But a Christian movement is also up against something sterner than the mere fickleness of taste. We have not yet had, at least in junior Oxford, any really bitter opposition. But if we have many more successes, this will certainly appear. The enemy has not yet thought it worthwhile to fling his whole weight against us, but he soon will. This happens in the history of every Christian movement, beginning with the ministry of Christ himself. At first, it is welcome to all who have no special reason for opposing it. At this stage, he who is not against it is for it. What men notice is its difference from those aspects of the world which they already dislike. But later on, as the real meaning of the Christian claim becomes apparent, its demand for total surrender, the sheer chasm between nature and supernature, men are increasingly offended. Dislike, terror, and finally hatred succeed. None who will not give it what it asks, and it asks all, can endure it. All who are not with it are against it. That is why we must cherish no picture of the present intellectual movement simply growing and spreading and finally reclaiming millions by sweet reasonableness. Long before it became as important as that, the real opposition would have begun, and to be on the Christian side would be costing a man at the least his career. But remember, in England the opposition will quite likely be called Christianity, or Christo-democracy, or British Christianity, or something of that kind. I think, but how should I know, that all is going reasonably well. But it is early days. Neither our armour nor our enemies is yet engaged. Combatants always tend to imagine that the war is further on than it really is.